Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the American Experiment podcast. I'm Grace Keating here with Bill Walsh, filling in for Catherine Hinderaker this week, who is sadly missing our 50th episode.
50th, really? 50?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Exciting.
Yeah, we've been through a lot of changes in that time.
I was
a lot of
there at the
different
beginning.
studios. Yes,
I was
you
there
were.
at one.
Yes, you were. Yeah.
Behind the scenes.
Yeah, different studios, different buildings. Had a fire in between.
That's true.
It's been a long journey, so thanks for sticking with us, guys. Stick around for the second half of today's episode. John Hinderaker is going to talk with David Zimmer, our public safety policy fellow, about a new report that he's just put out called Case Closed, I believe, kind of busting the myths of racial discrimination in our criminal justice system.
It's what we do. We do more myth busting or narrative breaking than anything else. There's a narrative that the criminal justice system is unfair to minorities. We bust that myth. The data shows that it's the opposite. Actually, as you work through the system, once someone's arrested, it kind of takes you from the point of arrest through the entire judicial system all the way to prison. The system is very fair, even tilted a bit against white criminals in that system. So read the report and stick around for the second half because David will give you a synopsis.
Yeah, it's going to be great. Also, a quick note in case you live under a rock and you have not heard, last week the Golden Turkey Award, our 6th annual, was awarded to...
Gobble, gobble. The state flag and seal design. The ridiculous, unnecessary state flag and seal design.
Yes. Which has
ran
to
away with the
change.
vote, 55%. It was started out as a close race between the Walls DEI staff and the flag, but the flag just pulled away, and a ton of people voted. So thank you.
Yeah, almost 8,000 this year. More than double the last several years, and yeah, our biggest year ever. So thanks to everyone who participated in that.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun going over to Joe Souchere's show. We always announce it. Always, we've done it 2 years, but it might be a thing now. We announced the winner there. He's kind of anticlimactic. You think you're going to build up to it. We're going to talk about the 4th place, 3rd place, runner-up. He's like, all right, who won? It's kind of Joe. So you got to just kind of tell him who won.
I did see they put like a cape on the trophy.
That was the flag. They draped the trophy. Well, that's the other big news is we got a trophy this year.
Yes.
The trophy is back at the trophy shop at Hisdall's in White Bear Lake. If you're in White Bear Lake area, Ramsey County, you need a trophy, you need any White Bear Lake gear, stop at Hisdall's on Highway 96. There's a commercial for him. I just did that.
Nice.
But he designed the trophy for us for fun. He was just listening last year and said, I got your trophy. He's putting the new name on there for the flag and seal.
It's really fast.
And actually, the trophy's quite popular, so it's making the rounds. We'll get it back at some point to show off here. But yeah, they put the flag on the trophy, which in like a cape. It was pretty creative, I thought. And we carried it into the studio like the Stanley Cup. That's a hockey reference, Grace.
Actually, I know that one.
That's
Thank
the
you.
most important trophy in sports.
Yeah.
And we carried it, and Joe said, where's your white gloves? Because we weren't wearing white gloves. Because the guys that handle the Stanley Cup always wear white gloves.
Oh, really?
Because it's it's a silver trophy. You don't want to get your fingerprints all
Is that
over it.
why?
And the oil, yeah.
Oh my gosh, interesting. Wow, thank you.
Out of respect. So we got to get white gloves next year to go with the Golden Turkey statue.
Yeah.
Or not statue. It's a
trophy.
It's a trophy.
Yeah. I would love if next year's winner was someone that we could hand it to. I don't think that's ever going to happen. It's because it can't be a person, but
yeah, there was a committee that put together the new flag and seal, but ultimately the legislature voted to do it. So who do you give it to?
And who would accept it?
Honestly, if there was one person that was behind this the whole way, not so much prominently in the front, but behind the scenes would be Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan. So we really should go deliver it to her, although she wouldn't really understand why she's getting it, or maybe she would, because you got to read more of the post we wrote about it, about why we did this or why they did this. I
didn't realize she was like a big force behind.
I'm just making that accusation completely unfounded. But
you can't do that.
But if you read the post we've written about one of the reasons they changed the flag is because they believed it was racist against Native Americans. And Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan's agenda is a lot about Native American rights and things in Minnesota. So I'm just saying, if there's anybody to give it to, she might be the one that would deserve the award.
Okay, interesting. Moving on. Our first story this week, I'm really excited about. American Experiment has sued the Minnesota Department of Education. Please explain why.
Well, it's over data that they're not, public data that they're not sharing with us. And, all data in Minnesota is public. And it is available for the public to see. Where anything done on state agencies, state governments, even city, local governments, data is public in Minnesota because
Okay.
we pay for what's happening. We have a right to know what's being done. We have a right to see data. There are some exceptions to public data. There's two big ones really. The main one is personnel. Things that deal with personnel. You can't go in and say, I want to see the employee records of that employee because they have a right to privacy in their personnel record.
Like salaries or just like
no,
employment
salaries
history?
we can
Salaries
see.
are public.
Salaries is definitely public.
Okay.
What we pay people in state government is public. Their personnel record, their private stuff, and hiring and firing, things like that.
Okay.
And the documents created for the creation of the governor's budget every year are private. That's a political act to put a budget together, and eventually he presents the budget in January. But the machinations and the work product that goes into doing that, the governor is allowed to say, hey, run that scenario, see what it looks like. And if that was public, whoever was affected by that run would be freaking out, saying, oh my God, they're going to cut this thing. Well, no, maybe not. The governor just wants to see that run, see what happens if we did that. He's allowed to put a budget together. That kind of stuff is. So that's specifically, data is public in the state of Minnesota unless the legislature specifically says it's not. So just understand that most data is public.
So what was the data that we wanted?
We are in this big fight not fight. This fight is over. We are implementing ethnic studies into the curriculum of schools in the state of Minnesota. We're doing it in several different ways. The social studies standards is the main way, and we've seen the social studies standards and what the benchmarks are, and there's ethnic studies throughout that document. But now there's a new ethnic studies law passed that requires ethnic studies to be taught and offered to students K through 12, infused into the curriculum, not just a social studies curriculum, but all curriculum. So math curriculum, reading, gym, health, all curriculum. Ethnic studies will be infused into the thing. So how are we going to do that? So the legislature created a committee, an advisory committee to advise the Minnesota Department of Education on putting together the teaching materials, the teacher prep materials, what teachers have to learn to do this, the actual, I wouldn't say curriculum because curriculum are decisions made in the local level, but a framework for teaching ethnic studies, infusing ethnic studies into the entire school system.
Okay.
So the committee's been working on this for a year. Certainly their work product is public.
Okay.
We have asked, and so they're meeting at the Department of Education, and we've gone over there. We're very interested in this topic. We've been writing about it, trying to tell Minnesotans what's happening, warning them, frankly, that we are, and we can do a whole show on ethnic studies, and we've done many on this in this podcast and elsewhere. But they were working on the framework this committee has, and they'll meet at the Department of Education. So we'll go over there and sit and watch the meeting. It's a public meeting. They're doing the work of the people, and then they'll break into a small group or subgroup. And so they have a general meeting where they do. By the way, they always do like the grounding exercise. It's really corny. They try to rope I was there one day watching. They're trying to rope me into some grounding exercise where they're tell us what's influencing you today. Oh, take a deep breath. No thanks. I'm just watching.
What did you say? You didn't even answer it.
I didn't participate.
Just passed.
I just stayed.
I want to be ungrounded today.
Back in the room. Yeah, I'm plenty grounded. Anyway, they
split off into other rooms.
And then they split off into rooms. We weren't allowed to
on.
follow them into the other rooms, so they were actually doing the work of putting together the framework to use in ethnic studies. They come back together at the end of the day and then report out. So you learn some things. You see some things in public. It was helpful.
How long are these? Like hours long? Is it
all
a full
day?
day?
All day. They've been working on for this for days. All of this was supposed to be public by now. It should have been public in October, according to the schedule laid out in the legislation, laid out by the Minnesota Department of Education. We would have expected to see drafts of the framework. In the law, there is a public input part of this.
Yeah.
And we would do this with our American Experiment audience. We would alert American Experiment watchers and say, hey, weigh in, and here's some talking points. We think these parts are bad. Maybe you weigh in, send a comment in.
That was supposed to happen in October?
Should have happened in October. We should see the document, the draft of the framework. The commissioner should be releasing that, and they haven't done that in the public process. So we sent an email. We know it exists because we've been in the meetings. We know these documents exist. We've been close to seeing the rooms happen. So we put in a request months ago and said, hey, send us the framework. It's public. It's public data. And they said no. And they stonewall. So so specifically we've asked for that framework information that's been going on in committees. And we've just been stonewalled. And in the data practices law, in Minnesota, an agency or a responding agency has a reasonable amount of time to comply. And you can charge people for things like photocopies and time spent gathering the information. This is easy. We know this framework exists. We know it's being shared on email between the committee members. Just send us a copy. It's an email. It's very simple. And so when they don't comply, normally it was 30 days. You got 30 days, you can take to kind of pull it together. Fine.
Okay.
Well, way more than 30 days has gone by. We've been frustrated. We had our lawyers, the Upper Midwest Law Center, send an email. Sometimes that works. Sadly,
just an email from a lawyer.
If we ask for it and don't get it, we have James Dickey from the Upper Midwest Law Center send an email on his official letterhead, and sometimes that's all it takes. I guess that's a threat to the lawyers involved, but hey, follow the law.
Well, just that you're not going to forget about it and move on. Yeah.
The law says, it's public. Send us the data, or tell us where in the law it's not public.
Sure.
Give it, and we haven't gotten either. So, unfortunately, in this case, a lawsuit has been filed. And part of it is just to get this data. Part of it is to say, enough with state agencies and the Walz administration stonewalling people asking for public information. They do this to the press. They do this to think tanks like ours. They do this to other policy groups. This is not new, but it is not good. And the lawsuit, just brings it to a higher level. For them to comply with the Minnesota Data Practices Request. By the way, and if you hear this term nationally, it's the Freedom of Information Act. You hear that nationally.
Yeah,
in Minnesota, the Freedom of Information Act is the Data Practices Act. So that's what we are suing under. So we'll see. We need the data from ethnic studies specifically, and we need the department and other departments in the Walz administration to stop stonewalling. By the way, I used to work in state agencies for the Plenty administration. As a matter of fact, I worked at the Department of Education. I handled many data requests from outside parties. I wasn't the official data guy, but I was the communications guy. So a lot of times I was the interface. Sure. And we internally felt pressure. Oh, we got clock is ticking, 30-day clock is ticking. Yeah. You better comply. Is it public? Is it private? Do we have to send it? Yes. Here's some things we can redact, and we can tell them why it's redacted under the law, but we comply, and you send that out. Or a lot of times people, in data practices world do phishing expositions. They'll say, I want every email with this word in it. And I'll email them back and say, what are you looking for? Tell me what you're looking for. I'll find it. You know? And a lot of times you can help them and get that data to them. So I know how this works. It's not that hard. This we know is easy because we've watched the committee work. Sure. We know the work product exists. They've referred to it in their public comments. So send us the data. Now, the politics are, of course, that the governor was on the ticket nationally for president, that if this would have been made public on the normal schedule, it could have influenced the vote. Yeah. Because this ethnic stuff is frankly radical. Yeah. And divides kids and is divisive. All the things we've been saying about it. So I'm assuming that there was politics behind it in terms of the timing of it. But now election's over. They lost. Move on. Send us the data. This ethnic studies fight's not going away. So that is the lawsuit. They
haven't even written back and said we're not going to do it, or give us some more time, or this is illegal. They're not even. We've had no communication back, right? It's just total radio silence?
I don't know that. Okay. I haven't followed it that closely. Okay. Our colleague, Catherine Wigfall, has been the contact. I'm assuming it's been little to no communication because there's a reasonable back and forth that can occur in the law. Yeah. But for us to go to the level of the lawsuit, I'm assuming we've gotten nothing. Gosh. Or we haven't been satisfied with any answers that we've received.
That's insane. It's so upsetting that this can even happen. You can go this long just breaking the law, not following the law. Mm-hmm. And it really does. It takes people like us, and it takes people like Upper Midwest Law Center to be there who are watching and waiting for this. I'm not waking up every morning being like, oh, where are those ethnic studies frameworks? Right. I wonder if they're out yet. I better go follow up.
We watch so you don't have to. And so, I encourage people to go reach. Catherine has a new blog up. That's why we're talking about it. Yeah. She just wrote about the lawsuit on our website at americanexperiment.org. So go read her. She might have the answer to that question you asked that I didn't know.
Well, I'll go read it right after this. Moving on. I assume you've heard about the new mayoral candidate in Minneapolis, Omar Fateh. Scandal plagued were the words Bill Glahn used to describe him. I feel like that's pretty fair since he first took office.
Senator Fateh, you judge a person by the company they keep. I think is the old adage here. Man, the company he keeps is a lot of folks that have had to that are in court in Minnesota that have been accused of fraud, some convicted of fraud.
Gosh.
People close to him we can go through the list. Bill Glahn has written a really good post that goes through the entire list of his problems since he's become a state senator, starting with his first election, where his opponent in the DFL primary, Senator Hayden, complained of voter integrity problems and issues.
Right.
One of his campaign people was, in fact, found guilty of campaign finance campaign election fraud, essentially.
Gosh. Was that like ballot harvesting, or was it like improperly using funds? Do you remember what the actual
You're
issue
challenging me on the
was?
specifics
Sorry.
again, and we should get
That's
Bill
okay.
Glahn in here. It's in the post, but I don't remember what exactly
get
it
Bill
was,
Glahn
but
here.
it was. But he was convicted, and he's also
Yeah.
his aide. So his campaign manager essentially commits election fraud to get elected, and then he hires him as his aide in the Senate.
Gosh.
And there was an ethics committee hearing, a process to get to the bottom of this in the Senate, and his aide just kept pleading the fifth. This is an employee of the Senate, pleads the fifth. This is a pattern that Bill writes about in his blog post. Senator Fateh frequently says, "I have no comment on that."
Oh, that's what pleading the fifth
it's
is,
a big
just like,
thing with
you
him,
can't.
and it's like, oh, not going to comment, not going to comment.
What?
And the local press, okay, well, we're going to go on. So now he's running for mayor. One of, I think, Bill's points in writing the piece was, when he has a press conference and runs for mayor, maybe somebody in the Minnesota press could raise their hand and say, hey, how about the employee you had that was convicted of election fraud?
Yeah.
How are we doing there? Or how about all of the people that gave you money, that funded your campaign for the state Senate, that ended up being on the list of people, I shouldn't say convicted, some convicted, many accused in the Feeding Our Future scandal. Senator Fateh had to give back. He didn't have to. He chose to give back 10 checks, thousands and thousands of dollars that funded his campaign from people that have now been accused of fraud in the Feeding Our Future scandal. Again, all the details are in Bill Glahn's post. But again, the company you keep, I mean, first thing you do when you run for office is you hit up your friends and family for money, because that's who gives money to your associates, your
own network,
people, right? Well, his people are scandal plagued, is what the headline is. So that's a problem. I mean, it goes on and on and on. I mean, with Senator Fateh. So, hey, Minneapolitans, can choose what they want for the direction of their city, but they really ought to examine this guy's record and the people he's hung around with, and the problems that he's had in the Senate since in his short political career before they promote him. It's a promotion from the state Senate to the mayor of Minneapolis is certainly a much bigger job, a much bigger budget, much more impact on the state. And, American Experiment, we care about Minneapolis, and the state, everyone really does need to care about Minneapolis. It's easy to write it off. I think Bill writes about that half the city council, or actually a little bit of a majority, are Democrat socialists. It's not even a Democrat-Republican fight in Minneapolis. It's Democrats and then socialists.
Yeah.
And the socialists have a majority, and Fateh fits into the socialist category. He's been endorsed by the Democrat Socialists of America.
Gosh.
So the point is, Republicans, conservatives, Minnesotans, people who live outside the city of Minneapolis need to care about the city of Minneapolis. It needs to be reformed. It needs to be turned around. It is the economic engine of the state of Minnesota. We cannot have a successful Minnesota without a successful Minneapolis. But we feel kind of helpless on the outside watching the city continue to make bad decisions and continue to elect people to leadership that are not going to change and make the changes necessary to get them out of the doldrums that they're in. So this is another choice they're going to have between Mayor Fry, who hasn't got the job done, and Omar Fateh, who wants to be the mayor. I mean, it's fun and interesting to watch from the outside, but there's a lot at stake for the state with Minneapolis, and that's why we write about it a lot. We try not to just be critics. We've got to turn Minneapolis around at some point. But Bill writes frequently, when the people in charge want things to change, things will change. And so the people of Minneapolis, the voters, if they continue to put leaders in place that have no interest in reforming things, or with a record like Fateh of scandal in his background, then there's not much we can do living in White Bear Lake or Brainerd or anywhere else in the state.
Yeah.
But we need to care.
Yeah, my concern looking at this is I feel like maybe before like the vice presidential run. But like with Walz, when people would try to bring up some of his older issues, like especially like the war record issue, people would say like, oh, well, like that's ancient history. Like they already dealt with that in past races. Like I feel like they tried for a long time to kind of bury past issues that were very much relevant to the races he was running in at the time, like especially this year. And it took him being on the national stage and getting attention from media outside of Minnesota for people to start caring about those older scandals. I hope that doesn't happen here because this is still recent enough. Maybe they won't be able to write it off, but you're right. Like no one's really asking him questions and getting answers right now.
I think that's an excellent point, and it's a lesson that hopefully the media and others in Minnesota can learn.
Yeah.
That when you step up to a higher office, and Minneapolis mayor is a higher office, that this scrutiny should follow, and and it should be added scrutiny as you move your career forward, because you're going to be making decisions that mean more, that have more money behind them, that more at stake. So yeah, that's a great point. They didn't do it in Walz. As he ran for governor, a lot of these things were there.
Yeah.
This stuff is sitting right there for voters to see. We're going to write about it. Hopefully others will too.
Yeah. Let's move on to our final story, which I'm really excited about. John Phelan wrote a post titled 13 Things for Minnesota's Legislators to Do. And I want to get your thoughts on some of these points because, to be honest, I don't understand a lot of these terms. And I want to hear how likely you think it is that some of these will pass. Like right off the bat, like I see like enact a taxpayer's bill of rights. What is that? Do other states have this?
Taxpayers' Bill of Rights.
Yeah.
Other states have done this. Colorado is the most celebrated example. It just talks about how much growth, how much the size of growth in state government is limited.
Really?
To a certain percentage. So government can grow 3% a year, 4% a year, 6% a year. I don't know what the Colorado one is.
Yeah.
So just government can grow, but it's going to only grow rate of inflation. Let's say.
Really cool.
So you connect the growth in state government to a metric, and it's capped. So we couldn't do what we did in 2023 when they went off the cliff and spent $18 billion and grew government close to 30%.
Yeah.
That would not fit in a taxpayer bill of rights. They call it TABOR because it's the acronym. It's a terrible acronym. But Taxpayers Bill of Rights just limits the growth in state government spending just automatically. It would take a constitutional amendment to do that. Legislature could pass it too, I guess. But so if you think government grows too fast, which we do, that's one way to control it.
Okay, that's cool. Okay, what else on this list jumps out to you as like being pretty likely, or at least within reach?
Well, John's agenda, our economist, he's still holding on to the state flag issue. Now we talked about that as winning the golden turkey, and one of the worst things they did, and the reason it was nominated for a golden turkey, which is a spending award, is that they forced everybody to change out their flags, seals, badges, patches by January 1st, 2025.
Right.
And John is holding on
1 month from now?
If they go into a special session like California did, and some say we're going to follow California's lead and go into a special session to somehow get prepared for the horrible Donald Trump administration that's coming, which is what California is doing. Oh. That if they're there, they could undo that part of the law and let cities and counties phase in patches, badges, changes in the flag. Okay. My fear is that they've already done it.
Yeah.
But maybe not. Maybe that could be still done even in January. We don't go into session until January 14th. The law is supposed to be done on January 1, so we'll see.
Interesting. What else? Like, what else has jumped out at you? Or maybe what are your priorities?
Well,
for this session, what are your hopes?
There's one on his list that I love, and it's an adopt a sunset provision for state regulations.
What on earth is that?
So you've heard a lot in the presidential campaign. It was part of Project 2025. Ooh, evil Project 2025. There's the new U.S. Supreme Court decision on bureaucrats, essentially trying to lower the power of bureaucrats to write regulations that effectively are laws. Legislators should be writing laws, but the bureaucracy gets so big that bureaucrats end up doing rules. You hear rulemaking regulations that end up being de facto laws, even though elected officials didn't pass them.
Sure.
So we've got the social studies standards, ethnic studies. These are things that can be done through rules instead of laws. The governor's electric car vehicle mandates were done in rulemaking. So a sunset provision for state regulations that they would have a time limit on them. All right, we're going to put this in place, but it sunsets in 8 years, in 10 years, unless the legislature votes to keep it going. So it gets the legislature back involved in a check on rules. I just kind of chuckle because I don't know what year it was it 2001 maybe, or 1999? I might have been later. I can't remember if it was later, but at one point we had a sunset committee in the legislature, and it was to actually work on sunsetting regulations like this and laws. and Mary Kiffmeyer actually chaired the Sunset Committee. And then House or Senate lost the majority, and the Democrats came into power and sunsetted the Sunset Committee before it really did any meaningful work. So I see sunset, and I always chuckle. We had a Sunset Committee for 2 years, and it was sunsetted by the Democrats. Things not on John's list that we'll add as we go is we've got to lift the ban on nuclear power generation in Minnesota.
Yeah, we talked about this.
We've got to get this going. This is going to be a number one thing. This might be an issue that has bipartisan support in a legislature that is essentially tied. So we have this mandate for renewables. Nuclear power is the cleanest fuel, and yet in Minnesota we have a ban on expanding nuclear power in the state. We've got to get rid of that ban. I know everybody says, well, it'll take a long time to power up a new nuclear plant. Absolutely. But we can't even start. We can't even have the conversation because of this nuclear ban.
Right.
And nuclear power is changing all over the world. There are smaller nuclear plants that are being built in France and other places, and even in the around the country that are obviously the technology keeps moving. So undoing the nuclear ban should be number one on the list. The other one is we did a number of events around the state recently on election reform, and out of that grew a short but really important election reform agenda. Top of the list being provisional balloting. We need a provisional ballot in place so that if you show up to register to vote on election day and you prove to the people there that who you are is who you are and where you live is where you live, that you vote provisionally until we can really prove that, because we really don't know until weeks after the election whether that's right or not, whether you were eligible to vote. Every other state that does election day registration has provisional balloting. We don't. It's a glaring error in our system. And then another one on the data side, we were just talking about public data. The challenged voter list, like let's say somebody did register, it ran into problems. By the way, their vote counted.
Gosh,
sorry,
I can't get over that.
But maybe later on we find some problems. There's some investigations done. There's some postcards sent. County attorneys working on it. It becomes a challenged voter in the system. We want access to the challenged voter list. We think it is public data. That was another lawsuit that went all the way to the state Supreme Court and had won at every level. Yep, public data. Yep, public data. Court of Appeals. Supreme Court said, nope.
Wow.
Secretary of State says it's private. It's private. I don't think there's any basis for it, but obviously the legislature could change that to tell the Supreme Court directly, no, we think this is public. That would alleviate some concerns about fraud. Certain groups like us, we could certainly delve into that challenged voter list.
Well, and that would be great because so many Minnesotans don't have confidence in their local elections.
Right. Our polling shows that. And this would be a way to do that. And if there is fraud, it would be in that challenged voter pile, which Steve Simon doesn't want us to see.
Yeah, if you missed those election integrity events this fall, go to our YouTube page. The full presentation is recorded there. It is, in terms of content and presentation, that is one of my favorite events we have ever done. So go to our YouTube, American Experiment, and check it out. Any final thoughts on this list of kind of legislative priorities? Oh, I did have one question. The state's hospital moratorium, does that just say that we can't build new hospitals? Is that all that means? What is that?
Actually,
and why?
It's more specific than that. The hospitals that we have, it's really beds. It's really we can't add beds without going to the legislature. So the last hospital built in Minnesota was in Maple Grove, obviously a big, fast-growing part of the Twin Cities, and that was in... Kurt Zellers was still in the legislature. He shepherded that through. So that's 2009, maybe 2010 is when that fight happened. So the legislature basically has a moratorium on they're controlling the number of beds, and it gets into follow the money. It's nonsensical regulation, over-regulation of the industry. So hospitals manage how many beds they have and open up at any given time. And getting rid of that, opening that up, would allow them to operate more efficiently and serve patients better. If you're concerned about patient care, you would get rid of this. So that's a number one priority for our senior policy fellow in healthcare, Peter Nelson. Yeah, why is the government even involved in that? That's ridiculous to me. I mean, it seems like it just slows things down. You should bring Peter on and ask him for that. I will. That's a whole podcast of what the government role is in regulating the number of beds available at a hospital. Wow. Okay. I'm really excited for this session. I think a lot of exciting things are going to happen. Thanks for joining us, guys. We're going to kick it over now to John and Dave to talk about his new report. We'll see you next time. American Experiment is supported by thousands of individuals like you.
To join the movement, go to www.americanexperiment.org and click the yellow donate button. From all of us here, thank you.
Welcome, everybody. I'm here with Policy Fellow David Zimmer. And David, we want to talk about your brand new report, which is hot off the press. It's called Case Closed, Minnesota's Offender Outcomes Devoid of Racial Bias. And maybe the easiest way to jump into this is to start with the observation that there's a lot more blacks in prison per capita than there are whites or Asians or I suppose most other ethnic groups. And it's kind of a commonplace among liberals to say, well, that's evidence of race discrimination.
Right.
The only possible reason why that could be true is because our criminal justice system is discriminating against blacks. So the fundamental purpose of your paper is to examine that idea and see if it's right or not.
Right. Examine that idea, kind of push back against the narrative that a disproportion in the criminal justice system equates to a unfair disparity.
And one of the things going on here is that, as I understand it, just in the last couple of years, Minnesota's Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, which provides a lot of statistical data on crime in Minnesota, but just in the last couple of years, they have started putting out data on the race of criminal offenders organized by crime. And that's a big part of what makes this analysis possible. Is that right?
Right. They've been capturing the data for a while, but they started reporting it in 2021. So when police take in data on an offender, they document the race or the gender, age, that type of thing. And that all gets reported to the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension now. And that information is now accessible as of 2021. And that allowed me to do this examination of who are the offenders by race of our major crimes.
And so information about the race of the offender, sometimes I suppose you wouldn't know, but an unsolved murder, for example.
Right.
But oftentimes maybe the perpetrator is caught on the act, or the victim or witnesses will give a description of the perpetrator to the police, and so that all gets recorded, and you add all that together, and now we've got that data from the BCA.
Right. And what's important about this offender data is it's a little less susceptible to bias. Traditionally, these types of analyses were done starting with police arrest data. And of course, people can accuse police of inserting some bias in who they're arresting and that type of thing. And the offender data is really devoid of that because you're talking about victims and witnesses of substantial crime, serious crime, that are picking up the phone and calling 911 and saying, this is what the person looked like who just robbed my store.
And if you're a crime victim, you're going to give an accurate description because you want the perpetrator caught.
Exactly.
Right? So this is the most reliable kind of information that we can have. And so let's just use that as a starting point. And what you've done, it sounds simple, but I understand how much work it took because I watched you do it. If you go through the data and you looked at serious crimes, right? And maybe just list what are we talking about when we say serious crimes?
Right. So I looked at the crimes of murder, aggravated assault, robbery, felony weapon crime, felony drug crime, and rapes. And I kind of limited it to that. So, fair warning or full disclosure here, this is not an analysis of every crime committed or small crimes like theft or motor vehicle violations. We're focusing on the major crimes that might lead to a prison sentence.
Right. And of course, the crimes that people care the most about.
Right.
So let's just start at the beginning. When you did that analysis, what did you find with respect to the per capita rate? And by the way, your report, you confined it to blacks and whites, right?
That's right.
We have some other minority groups in Minnesota, but you did the analysis on a black versus white comparison.
Right. That's the primary comparison that's always made in terms of the criminal justice system and race.
Yeah. So when you did that analysis of offender rates, as you described, what did you find?
So what I found is for the serious crimes we just discussed, Black Minnesotans were 11 times more likely to be identified as an offender of one of those crimes. So they, accounting for their proportion of the population, they were 11 times more likely to be an offender of those serious crimes.
So on a per capita basis,
Right.
11 times as
Right.
likely. Well, that's obviously, when you talk about discrepancies, disparities, whatever you want to call them, that's a huge one,
Right.
That's a huge one. And so the rest of your paper, I think it's fair to say, in the rest of your paper, you follow a year's worth of perpetrators through the criminal justice system. And you look at arrest rates and charge rates, incarceration rates, and so forth. And also, this is important, we'll get to it at the end, but victimization rates.
Right.
And so let's just kind of walk through the report, walk through the system. So first of all, you got a perpetrator. Well, then the next question is, did he get arrested?
Right. And, before we skip on to arrest, I think it is worthy of noting, while 11 times more likely, it seems like a big ratio, it actually gets even more absurd, if you will, when you look at some of the other crimes. So assaults, 16 times more likely. Robberies, 84 times more likely.
Weapons crimes, 17 times the per capita rate. Murder, 33 times. These are pretty shocking numbers.
Right. So getting on to your question about what I wanted to do is establish who the offenders were. And now, again, to be fair, this was not a case-specific analysis. There is no database of everyone that's identified as an offender because some of the offenders aren't ever identified, right? So this is an analysis of what's the word?
Well, it's a cohort of people.
You
start out with a bunch of people here in Minnesota who commit serious crimes, and you look at those numbers, right. And then you look at the numbers for those who got arrested, for those who were prosecuted, et cetera.
Right.
Is that fair?
That's fair.
And so when you looked at the arrest data, what did you find?
So contrary to the narrative that blacks are arrested at greater rates than whites, what I found is if you look at who's actually committing the offenses, so the offenders, and you put them into the denominator as opposed to the general population, what we find is that that narrative flips, and white offenders are actually arrested 1.5 times more likely to be arrested than black offenders.
For serious crimes.
For the serious crimes.
And by the way, one point that's maybe worth making here before we continue talking about arrests, I think it factors in there too. The large majority of the population is law-abiding.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So when you say blacks in Minnesota commit serious crimes at 11 times the per capita rate that whites do, that's a striking number. But the reality is that in both of those demographics, large majority of people are law-abiding.
That's a great point. I want to make sure people understand this is not a bashing of black Minnesotans, our neighbors. We're just trying to dispel this narrative that the system is creating unfair disparities.
So the number of people who commit serious crimes is a pretty small sliver of the population.
Right.
However, honestly, looking at the data on a per capita basis, that sliver is considerably larger in the black population.
Right. It is.
And we're going to talk about this in more detail later, but the victims of the crimes committed by that sliver of the population, they are themselves, too, overwhelmingly black.
It's probably the number one reason I did this analysis and wrote the report is because of that end conclusion. I'm not trying to tear apart our system for no reason. I'm trying to get to the point of what really matters. And what matters is when you take consequences out of our system, based on some faulty racial idea, the people you're hurting the most are the very people in those communities where crime is
the victims.
Right, the victims.
Okay, so I'm glad we made that point because it's important, and you see it all through the
Right.
report. So now you get to the arrest stage, and I think a lot of people would be surprised by this finding. On a per capita basis, based on the offender rate, white people in Minnesota are actually 1.5 times more likely to be arrested for serious crimes than black people. Now, I assume that's not because the cops are out there, discriminating against white people. Do you have a theory as to why that would be?
Well, my theory and from my experience, I think it comes down to this. It's areas where black crime is prevalent are sometimes so overwhelmed by the amount of crime that's going on that the likelihood that somebody's going to get caught and punished for that is less than in an area where there isn't as much crime. So the example I use often is if a convenience store in North Minneapolis is robbed 25 times in a year, the likelihood that every one of those perpetrators is going to get arrested and held accountable and sentenced in prison is very unlikely compared to a store in Hinckley, Minnesota that gets robbed once in 3 years. That person is more than likely going to get caught, going to be held accountable. And so I really think that plays into why some of these disproportions in arrests and charges and sentencing that we see occur.
Great. So, what's the next step?
So I analyzed arrests, and then the next step was charges. And so when you look at who was charged or what the ratio of black to white offenders facing criminal charges, what we found is, so for arrests, it was 1.5 times more likely. With charges, so the county attorney charging a criminal with one of these serious crimes, white offenders were 1.7 times more likely to be charged with a crime.
So that's really interesting. So the disparity, if you will, between white and black offenders that we saw at the arrest stage actually grows now at the charging stage?
It grew slightly at the charging stage.
Okay.
And then that progresses to once somebody is found guilty and sentenced by a judge, what we found is those serious offenders, white serious offenders who were found guilty, were 2.2 times more likely to be sentenced or found guilty and sentenced. So they continued to grow at the sentencing stage.
So again, this is a complete repudiation of what a lot of people have tried to tell us about racial bias in the criminal justice system, isn't it?
Right. At least at this serious crime level, yes.
And in fact, it seems like as you go through the system, at least so far, we'll see, we got a couple more steps to go, but at least so far, it seems like the more you go through the system, the more negatively it is balanced for whatever reason against whites as compared to blacks.
Right. And I think a lot goes back to what we just talked about. It's the volume that the system is dealing with. And again, we're talking about the whole state here. So when we're dealing with cases in outstate Minnesota where very seldom does a robbery or a murder or whatever occur, when they do occur, they're more likely to be caught and punished and held accountable.
So that's the sentence being pronounced. What's the next stage?
So then I looked at the figure that we just talked about was based on the offenders. So that offenders who were arrested and charged and convicted, white offenders were 2.2 times more likely. Now, when you do the analysis, you switch up that denominator to who was actually sentenced. white offenders were 1.1 times more likely to be sentenced to prison. So again, the first one was who was sentenced to a felony or who received any kind of sentence. This analysis is who went to prison. And
out of those who were sentenced to something.
To something, right. The vast majority of sentences do not end up with a prison sentence. They're more probation or go to the workhouse or that type.
A lot of people don't realize it, but most felony convictions do not result in a prison sentence.
Right. But those that went to prison, white offenders were 1.18 times more likely to be sentenced to prison for these serious crimes.
And then at this point, the analysis starts getting, I would say, a little bit more subtle, and you start talking about the sentencing guidelines, right?
Right. And what was different with this report than I did a similar report last year, and that was my first foray into reports. But I did a deeper dive this year, and I got a hold of some case-specific information from the Sentencing Guideline Commission. And that allowed me to do even a deeper dive, as I say, and do some case-specific analysis and not these big expanded groups, but really look at real people and follow them through the sentencing process.
So for example, you've got a chart here in your report where you're comparing presumptive versus actual prison commitment. Right. And presumptive, that means presumptive under the sentencing guidelines.
Right. That's a term from the Sentencing Guideline Commission where the system is set up so that if you do this, this, and this, it's presumed this will be your sentence. So
let's talk about that a little bit more, David, because now this next section of your report goes into that pretty heavily. So we've got a Sentencing Guidelines Commission. We've got kind of a grid that sets out the things that are to be taken into account by the judge in deciding on a sentence, and it includes, well, you tell me, what are the things that the judge is instructed to take into account?
Well, the grid really points the judge into the square of the grid that the sentence should land, and we have it in the report here.
An actual copy of the
grid, and maybe we can put that up on the screen during our talk here. But what the grid takes into account is on the horizontal axis, it takes into account the severity level of the conviction. So not every murder is the same. Some are extremely violent and intentional, and others are unintentional and down the line. The vertical grid takes into account the criminal history score of the offender. So, are they a 5-time felon? Were they on probation or parole at the time of the offense? All of those things get taken into account, and they get assigned a criminal history score along the top grid.
And I think we should pause here, David, and just remember a little bit why we have this system, right? Because I remember when this came into being, and there were a lot of complaints about the fact that judges were really inconsistent.
Right.
There was a huge amount of discretion that judges had in sentencing criminals who'd been convicted. And there were examples that would be brought up in the newspapers and so on of really, really disparate sentencing. And so the goal here was to have consistency in sentencing and to have accountability where the judges have got some instructions on what they're supposed to take into account. What is the presumed sentence,
right,
the presumptive sentence that you should get if you commit this crime and you've got this criminal history? That points you to a box on the grid. And so the idea was to have uniformity, in sentencing, and that goal really it was a good goal, and it's really been achieved, right?
Admirable goal, and you hit the nail on the head. It's uniformity across the state, no matter where you are in the state, no matter what your gender or race or age is. If you commit X, Y, and Z in the northwest part of the state versus the southeast part of the state, you should get a very close sentence.
And that uniformity
similar.
also is intended to prevent bias of
Right.
many different kinds. It could be racial bias, but it could be many other kinds of bias on
Right.
the part of the judge from really influencing the sentence.
Right. So my analysis really confirmed that the system's working as it's intended to work, and that's a good thing. It's a good thing for all of us. What I found is remarkable consistency in the sentencing. And so on page 15 of the report, we have a Minnesota presumptive versus actual prison commitment analysis. And what that means is you take all the offenders who were sentenced or presumed to go to prison, and I have a rate there. That rate equated to a ratio of 1.18 to 1 for white offenders. And then you look at who actually went to prison. And if you had a biased system or an unjust system, you would assume that that ratio would skyrocket for people of color, right? But the actual rate of commitment was exactly the same as the rate of presumptive commitment, meaning the judges were sentencing people irrespective of race exactly the same, or exactly as they should.
Yeah, per the sentencing guidelines.
Right.
Yeah. And then you go on to talk about presumptive versus actual prison commitment.
And
how is Figure 10 different from Figure 9? Let me ask you.
Great question, because every once in a while when I'm reading this, I say, what in the heck was I doing here? But what I was doing is Figure 9 was based on who the offenders were. This is a more focused look on who was actually sentenced. So this Figure 10 is the ratio derived from the serious crime pronounced sentences. So these are real people. I looked at real cases. And what you find here is that of those committed to prison, blacks were 1.1 or 1.82 times more likely to receive a presumptive prison commitment and 1.82 times more likely to receive an actual prison commitment. Again, very consistent. And I know what people might be thinking, well, wait, that's different. Now all of a sudden, black offenders are more likely to be going to prison.
Right, exactly. So this is a key point you make in this report, and I want to pause for a couple of minutes here because it's what you've done here is, I think, a very sophisticated analysis and a really important one. And so what we're seeing here is that where the sentencing guidelines would have a presumption of the person going to prison, it's the same. It's blacks and whites the same. However, there's more blacks going to prison. What that means, I guess, is that under the sentencing guidelines, the crimes that blacks commit are more apt to generate a presumed prison sentence.
Well,
did I say that right?
Partially, I would go even a step further. And so what I did is I analyzed that group. When I first came up with that data, I thought, here's something that shows maybe this does support that in this area, the system is creating a disparity. So I wanted to really dig into that. And I took those thousands of sentences and I really analyzed them deeply. And so if you look at figures 14, 15, and 16, what my analysis shows and explains is why those sentences were longer. Figure 13 shows that on average, black serious crime prison commitments were 10 months longer or 15% longer than white prison commitments. But there's a reason for that. And what I found was, again, if you go back to the sentencing guideline grid, there are these different variables that play into a sentence. So what was the severity of the crime? What was the criminal history score of the offender? And then another variable that we haven't talked about yet is whether or not the offender used a weapon in commission of the crime. And each of those, if you have a high criminal history score, if the crime you committed was extremely serious and violent, or if you used a gun in the commission of the crime, you would expect the system's going to treat you a little more sternly and you would get a longer sentence. And that's exactly what we see here. So figure 14 describes or shows that the severity level of these serious offenses indicates that the black offenders had on average 1.22 points higher score on the severity level. So on the axis, on the vertical axis on the sentencing guidelines, they were a full point higher in severity level than white offenders on average. And if you look at the grid itself, going from, say, a severity level of 7 to 8, you're already well over 10 months right there. So one severity level point accounts for that difference in sentencing that I found.
And then you got criminal history.
Yep. Criminal history score, on average, they were black offenders were 0.37 points higher, so a little less than a half a point. And then on the issue of using a dangerous weapon in commission of the crime, the black serious offenders that we analyzed here going to prison were 3.7 times more likely, almost 4 times more likely to have used a weapon in the commission of their crime.
So this is super interesting, David, and I think it's really important. So somebody who is trying to support this narrative of racial bias in the criminal justice system could look at this and say, whoa, blacks who are being sentenced to prison are on the average being sentenced to a longer prison term for a given crime. You know, whether it's murder, robbery, rape, whatever it might be, that's evidence of race discrimination. But what you're saying here is, well, wait a minute. There are factors that go into that sentence that have been decided by the Minnesota legislature, and they're in the sentencing guidelines. And they are pretty obvious, right? How severe was the crime? What's your criminal history? Are you a first-time offender? We're going to treat you worse if you're a 4-time offender, right? And did you use a weapon? And this is really striking to me. Blacks in this category we're talking about who are being sentenced to prison are almost 4 times as likely to have used a weapon.
Yep. And to me, that's just, it's logical and it's reasonable for the system to hold offenders that are doing these types of things more accountable and more, issue more severe penalties.
And I think all of us, we talked earlier about the fact that the vast majority of the population is law-abiding, right? And I think all of us who are part of that vast majority of law-abiding people would totally sympathize with the idea that if somebody commits a crime against me, he should be punished more severely. Number one, if the crime is more severe. Number two, if he's a repeat offender. And number three, if he's holding a gun to my head.
Exactly.
Right?
Yep.
And so that's exactly what we see here.
It is. Yeah.
So the last element in your paper, which are we ready to get to victims? I don't want to skip over. I think we've covered most of the highlights, although there's more data in the paper.
Well, the one point I'd like to make here on page 23 is just I go back and I re-examine that old narrative of I established what the offender ratio was, 11-to-1, black to white serious offenders. And I make the point that if we had a criminal justice system that was biased and treating people of color in a disparate way, we would see that ratio increase by the time people were sentenced to prison. And if you take the offender population or the general population and derive a black to white ratio, black citizens are 8.5 times more likely to be in prison than whites, but the offenders are 11 times more likely. That was a word salad to say the ratio is smaller than you would expect if we had a racially disparate and unfair system.
Well, that's really important, and you want to say it carefully, right? These are complicated. We're talking statistics here, and you want to make sure that you're articulating it correctly. But just to make sure that's clear, people look at the population of those who are in prison, and they say, well, on a per capita basis, there's 8.5 times as many blacks in prison as there would be if it was just randomly distributed through the population. And many people have said, well, that obviously there's got to be racial bias, whether it's in the police force, it's in the district attorney's office, it's in the judges, but there's got to be some bias. But actually, the fundamental point of your paper is no, that's not a reflection of bias, because at the beginning, when you look at who committed the crimes, the ratio there is 11 to 1.
Right.
And by the time you look at the prison population, it's down to 8.5 to 1.
Yep, it actually decreased. Right. So then I ended with who's being harmed by all this the most. And it really isn't, we all pay a price for high crime, but the law-abiding black Minnesotans are the ones suffering the most from our system's unwillingness to acknowledge and hold black offenders accountable at the same rate as white offenders. And so in the end, what I did is I took a look at who all of the known victims were of all of these serious crimes that we've been analyzing. And on a per capita basis, I determined that white or black law-abiding Minnesotans were 5.5 times more likely to be a victim of these serious crimes. And that's really unacceptable and should be to everyone, whether you're conservative, progressive, black, white, anything.
And so when we see some of these suggestions that the criminal justice system, the law enforcement system is racist, biased against blacks, and so on, the solutions that people propose always seem to involve fewer arrests, fewer prosecutions, less incarceration, specifically of black people, to kind of bring those numbers down.
Right.
But if you don't arrest, you don't prosecute, you don't incarcerate criminals, what you're doing is you're creating more victims.
Yep, you're enabling this to continue, and the very people that some on the left say they're out to support, they're actually harming in the long run.
David, you made just a brief reference earlier to your experience. I want to talk about that for a minute to kind of close the circle here on this conversation. You came to American Experiment after a 33-year-long career in the Hennepin County Sheriff's Office.
Right.
And you retired, I think, as a captain in that office.
Yep.
But you had decades of experience in actual crime fighting, unlike the rest of us, right?
Right. I was a detective for about 20 years. Actually worked in Minneapolis homicide for a year or so. And I'm very familiar with the crimes that I analyzed here in this report. And, it's a personal thing to me. I saw the effect this was having. I'm born and raised in Minneapolis. I'm a Minneapolis kid, and I hate to see what's going on in our signature city, I always call it. And this report helps bolster the efforts of anyone that wants to fight back against this narrative that our system is creating unfair disparities.
And the conclusion that you come to in this report, namely that this relatively large number of blacks who wind up enmeshed in the criminal justice system, it's not because police are going and snagging them off the street, it's because they've committed crimes. I mean, is that consistent with your 33 years of experience in law enforcement?
It is. It is. Sadly, the offender rate in the black community is obviously elevated, especially if you're an officer on the street.
And it would be kind of absurd to try to deny that, wouldn't it, if you have any experience at all in,
I would think so.
in urban law enforcement?
Right.
But then the other side of the coin, and I want to finish, David, with this. Have you also had the experience at your years, on the street, actually dealing with crime, in working in black communities? And what input did you get from them, the law-abiding people that you were trying to protect?
I always think back to an incident on about 23rd and DuPont Avenue North. If we had I think it was a murder, that it might have been just a non-fatal shooting, but we were out doing a canvass of the neighborhood, meaning you're going up and knocking on doors to ask if anyone saw what happened out. The shooting had happened right out on the street. And what I came away with was hope for the future. And it's always stuck with me, because no matter the race of the people that answered that door, they all wanted the violence to stop. They were afraid, everybody was afraid to be seen speaking with the police, but that there wasn't I didn't come away with the feeling that it's hopeless, and that the people in that community didn't care that there was violence going on in their street. And so I hope that a report like this, even though it's a little uncomfortable, it's uncomfortable to talk about race and crime, but it's an important topic, and we have to get past that uncomfortableness and talk about facts and talk about the reality of the situation. If you're not willing to acknowledge what the issue is, how are you ever going to fix it?
And solid public policy, good public policy, it's got to always start with the truth.
Right.
What's the reality? What are the facts?
Right.
Well, David, you've done a great job of bringing the facts here to people in Minnesota, and I think this report will be of great interest across the country as well, because I suspect that other states, you could do the similar analysis in other states, and you'd probably get pretty similar conclusions. So, David Zimmer, thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks, John.